Hello friends, in our last two Tears of the Kingdom videos we talked about the potential for dungeons and what that could do to impact the story of the game. So go check those videos out if you haven't yet. Today's focus will be on something a little less in-universe and a little more on the real-life development side of things. But before we get into that, I'd like to welcome back to the channel the one and only Hyrule Gamer, who I'm sure you all know, but make sure to go check his channel out for some fabulous Zelda content. I'll have links to his channel down below, and thank you so much HD for joining me here. I really appreciate it, man.
Hey folks, Hyrule Gamer here. I'm happy as always to be working on something fun Zelda related with Daniel and look forward to getting into it. So, let's do it.
As fans, we tend to think of game development in a way that is very sequential. Fans yearn for a complete Ocarina of Time beta even decades after the final game. And in recent years, we've managed to learn more than we ever thought possible about that. But something important to note is that game development isn't so segmented. It's a fluid process like any creative endeavor, meaning that a complete beta of a game probably isn't just one thing. Games like Breath of the Wild are built by enormous groups of people over the course of years. Things are tweaked and adjusted constantly. We may get snapshots of certain moments in a game's development, but the process is one of constant change and flow.
Among all the different gaming series in the industry, The Legend of Zelda is unique in that it is constantly reinventing itself. It's probably the only series in the world that can show us these two trailers during the same E3 presentation in 2019 of the upcoming sequel to Breath of the Wild and the remake of Link's Awakening respectively, with two vastly different visual identities and art directions. And we the fans instantly accept that these are two entries in the same series. Zelda has endured as a series because of its willingness to change and evolve. One great reason for this is the willingness of its developers to listen to fan feedback. It's been documented over and over that this is the case. For example, when audiences at the time were adverse to Wind Waker's art direction, Nintendo came out swinging with Twilight Princess, which may come across as course correction, but like game development itself, the series is always growing and evolving, which is a good thing.
More recently, series producer Eiji Aonuma has gone on record to say how Breath of the Wild was influenced by the reception to Skyward Sword. In an interview with Vice, Mr. Aonuma once stated, "We do actually pay a lot of attention to what fans are saying after every Zelda is released. We want to know how people have found each game, how they've reacted to it, what their experiences were, and we also take on board what people are saying in the run-up to a new Zelda's release. Sometimes I'll see a reaction to a trailer perhaps, and the opinions that resonate most with me, I definitely take them into account when the time comes to create the next Zelda." Later in the same interview he says, "Actually, we did have in mind from the start of development that we wanted to create a large, wide, expansive world, and part of the reason for that comes from the feedback we got after Skyward Sword. The way that game's world was set up was that you had kind of separate areas, separate strongholds, and you'd sort of land in and explore, but they were all self-contained and they weren't really connected together. We listened to a lot of opinions from people who played Skyward Sword, and a lot of people said to us how they found the game not exactly unsatisfying, but that they wish they could have explored the areas between these strongholds. So taking that on board from the very start of Breath of the Wild, we wanted to and set out to create a world that wasn't only vast, but where everything was connected. So you really could freely explore the world without these barriers or gaps imposed."
It seems that this feedback is something Mr. Aonuma and the Zelda team as a larger whole takes very seriously, and so setting to break conventions and appeal to the audience of players who wished to be able to explore freely was the goal with Breath of the Wild from the start. This is of course a more recent documented example, but there are numerous times in which the series has taken shape in direct response to the feedback from fans. And I think that there is a good chance this is the case with Tears of the Kingdom yet again. Some things to consider here as well is that early footage of Breath of the Wild seems to be pretty different from the final game. There are broad stroke similarities in the overall map layout, but the things to do in the the world, and the small details of the environment all have minor adjustments. Between this early footage and the treasure trove of concept art and ideas found in the behind the scenes book Creating a Champion, we can also infer that there was at one time a very different story in the works for Breath of the Wild.
Shrines, as we know them in Breath of the Wild, share a constant design, based on ancient Japanese Jomon pottery. But that wasn't always the case. Early versions of these dungeons had much larger and more dramatic entrances. And yes, I do say dungeons, because at one point the dungeon's scope was apparently much larger before being broken up into these smaller shrines. In this interview with Time, Aonuma said, "At first we were planning to include more large labyrinth-style dungeons, the sort of things you'd expect in a Zelda title, but the reason we decided to include these smaller shrines was to strike a balance between this extremely large overworld that you're exploring and these goals and objectives to explore within that. So by dotting these shrines around, a larger number of them, but with each smaller in size than the older style dungeons, it helped bring up balance and break up the huge world into smaller, explorable chunks."
So at one point we had dungeons that were very different from what we got in the final game. It's even possible that the puzzles and concepts found in the shrines were individual dungeon rooms that got broken up and split into shrines, but that's just speculation. That said, dungeons are one thing fans have been asking for since Breath of the Wild's release. It was one major point of fan feedback, much the same as Skyward Sword's linearity and segmented overworld, so speculating that traditional dungeons will return seems reasonable to me.
That said, I've already made 2 videos about that subject, so we'll move on. Last year, my pal Game Over Jesse made this video in which, by upscaling and examining footage from the Game Awards 2014, he was able to find some of these golden shrines dotted around the world of Hyrule. It's worth noting as well the confidence in which they say that the game will release in 2015. And it's worth noting how the UI features no Sheikah Slate or anything to that effect. We see both the scope and the map, when compared to the final game, don't use the Sheikah Slate. It didn't exist yet. At this point, the game map overall is also very close to the final product. We get a quick glimpse of it here, so here's what I think, my pure speculation. I believe that at this point, the game was almost complete. They had dungeons, a story, and a completed world. But then they decided to upend the tea table, and one reason for that, I believe, is the Guardians. Earlier that same year in 2014, we actually had gotten our first ever glimpse at the game, a game simply known at the time colloquially as Zelda Wii U. The trailer shows a glimpse at the world, which was not quite as complete as the Game Awards footage later that year, and Link being pursued by a Guardian, before stopping to confront it. At this time, the Zelda creator community on YouTube experienced something of a renaissance. Channels like Zeltic, Commonwealth Realm, Game Over Jesse, McIntyre, and plenty more took off, with their analyses and theorization taking the Zelda community by storm. And one topic seemed to resonate with all of them. What was this enemy? A massive machine? What looked like a giant Beamos combined with an Octorok? And what was this special weapon that Link was using against it? Some sort of custom-built arrow that he uses separate from bomb arrows.
We now know, of course, that this is simply a Guardian, and that this is an ancient arrow. But at the time, was this actually so important? The answer is no. At this time, Guardians were not really important to the story of the game, and were simply common enemies. In that same interview with Time mentioned earlier, Mr. Aonuma said, "When I request something be put in the game, there's usually a reason why I want to see that element. In the trailer, there was a scene where the Guardian chased after Link. In creating a huge world, I went back to the first Zelda title, and I wanted to see an enemy like an Octorok. Octoroks to me when I was playing felt really large. That's why the first enemy we created for the game was the Guardian. But then just creating a large octopus is kind of gross. So we decided to take the more sci-fi technology route. And that's where the visual for the Guardian comes from. And that decision leads into the storyline, and influenced many other elements we added to the game."
So initially, Mr. Aonuma wanted a simple, large enemy, akin to the Octoroks we encounter in Zelda 1. That's all it was meant to be at the time. But we fans are ravenous, and this trailer was all the information we had. So of course we ate it up. Then the game was delayed, and every time we saw more glimpses of info, the Sheikah technology was given more and more emphasis. So what I am proposing is that the Zelda team specifically changed the game's story to focus more heavily on Sheikah technology after 2014, as at this time it seemed that beyond the Guardian being a common enemy, there was not any Sheikah tech present in the game. Even the shrine we get a glimpse of is one of these golden shrines that we see concept art for in Creating a Champion, yet the game was supposedly near completion, so this delay is the only thing that makes sense in my head. Now we know as well that the sequel to Breath of the Wild began development as DLC that got so out of hand and content heavy that it ended up warranting being an entirely new game. The development team simply had too many ideas. But when was this decided? They officially announced the sequel in 2019. However, in the back page of Creating a Champion, which came out a year earlier, Mr. Aonuma states here that the sequel was already in development. So I believe a proper full sequel was in the books sooner than we thought, and certain ideas were withheld or even removed from Breath of the Wild so that they could be used for Tears of the Kingdom instead. And those ideas, those changes, in my head, all come down to one central subject matter: the Zonai. There is not one single subject in Breath of the Wild that is more mysterious or heavily theorized about. The Zonai, whose name is literally a Japanese pun on the word mystery, were created for Breath of the Wild with the purpose of making the world feel more alive and well-rounded, by virtue of having a lost ancient civilization.
Considering earlier builds of Breath of the Wild had more Zonai-esque imagery than the final game, such as these towers which were changed between 2016 and 17, and if the Zelda team was willing to take fan feedback and change the story of Breath of the Wild, fitting in more Sheikah related content, then it stands to reason they would do the same for Tears of the Kingdom with the Zonai. It's the subject we as a larger community have been fascinated by for years now. If a Guardian can go from simply being a common, large enemy, like an Octorok, to having a large, fleshed out backstory, to the entire game focusing on this lost Sheikah technology, with dungeons set in the innards of these massive machines, well, I see no reason that the Zonai would not be the focal point of Tears of the Kingdom in much the same way.
It's even possible that some of what we'll see in Tears of the Kingdom was intended for or even removed from earlier builds of Breath of the Wild, only to be replaced by Sheikah shrines or other such story elements, considering we find Sheikah shrines within Zonai structures like the Lomai Labyrinths and the Spring of Courage in Faron Woods, an area literally called Zonai Ruins. It could be that larger ancient dungeons once stood in these places, and were swapped out with shrines to fit the new direction of Breath of the Wild's story. Now, with any luck, the dungeons we'd see wouldn't all share the same aesthetic. That was an issue with Breath of the Wild's shrines and divine beasts. But some Zonai-themed structures are almost certainly going to be prevalent in this game. That much is safe to say, just from looking at the trailers that we've gotten so far. And I have no doubt at this point that we'll be learning not just about who this tribe of people were, but their involvement in the history of Hyrule.
These concepts don't just apply to the game's story focus either. It seems as though the new vehicles we've seen in Tears of the Kingdom stem from all the weird physics-based antics that players have done within Breath of the Wild. As if Nintendo saw us stacking minecarts and building flying machines and said, "Oh, you want a flying machine? We'll give you a real flying machine then." It really just feels like they're leaning into the weirdness. For the better.
But of course, this is all speculative. I think I've done a decent enough job of making my case and backing it up with what information is available to me, but the truth is that until we have Tears of the Kingdom in our hands, we simply don't know for sure what this game's story will hold. But I believe that we, as a larger Zelda community, with our sleuthing, cross-examination, and theorizing, have had a larger impact on the game's story than we ever truly knew. And once again, I'd like to open the conversation up to you guys. Please comment down below and let me know what you guys think of not only the Zonai, but how we as fans have potentially impacted the game's story. Tears of the Kingdom is only 2 months away now, and I cannot wait to play this game. And once again, I would like to thank Mr. HG for joining me on this video. Make sure to go check the link in the description so that you can head over to Hyrule Gamer's channel and check out some more excellent Zelda content over there. I highly recommend it. And thank you so much for joining me here, man. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on this video. It's been a pleasure discussing this, and I hope you all enjoyed. I myself make all sorts of Zelda videos over on my channel, and would be honoured if you want to go check some of those out. But for now, until the next time, I've been Hyrule Gamer.
Bye-bye. Thank you all so much for watching. Before we end this off, I just wanted to say thank you to the lovely people who supported me on Patreon or here on YouTube as a channel member, including but not limited to Grey Mage, Brenda, Tetra, Callie, Gail, Hylian West, Justin, Clifford Longhead, Midnight Naomi, and Bunny. Thank you all so much for the support and for watching, and I will catch you all next time. Bye-bye.